has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the morning. Sweet the rain's new fall, sunlit from heaven, like the first dew fall of the day.
Well, that was Cat Stevens' Morning Has Broken. It was a great song back in my youth, and a version of that song has been in many hymnals through the years as well. Welcome to Stab the Dragon, as we continue a quick survey of the Old Testament. Not sure how quick it's going to be, and not sure how far we'll get, but we're going to have fun trying. So right now, this is the second edition of this study, and we're going to pick up where we left off. We had finished kind of an introduction to the Bible, and now we're going to give a very brief introduction to Genesis, because Genesis is the beginning point. First of all, let's talk about the author. Unlike our books today, it's very common in the Bible to not have any author's name as part of the text. Essentially, books of the Bible are anonymous for the most part. The events recorded in Genesis happened long before Moses was born, but it is Moses who is named throughout the Bible as being the author of the law, which includes Genesis through Deuteronomy. Joshua 8:31 mentions the book of the law of Moses, but that verse really is kind of referring back to a specific verse in Deuteronomy 27. And we see in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 3, there's a mention of the law of Moses, but that again seems to be referring back to a particular verse in Deuteronomy 29. So what I found is that there's really not a verse that directly says Moses wrote Genesis on this particular occasion. So it's just not there. Kidner writes, while the New Testament speaks of the Pentateuch in general as Moses or the book of Moses, it nowhere points specifically to Genesis by itself in these terms. The New Testament, in attributing the Pentateuch as a whole to Moses, seems to imply for Genesis a similar relation between substance and final shape, as it implies for the rest of the books. But both the Old and New Testaments attribute the book of the law, the book of Moses, to Moses. And Genesis is included in the book of the law, so there you go. I was taught the Wellhausian theory of source criticism 35 years ago when I was in seminary, using the JEDP understanding, that formula, J being the Yahwist, E being the Elohim, D the Deuteronomist, and P the priestly. These are all sources of Genesis and the rest of the book of the Pentateuch. But that theory has kind of gone by the wayside. I never really bought into that theory. After studying Genesis on my own, to me, it's a book that is so brilliantly written. It's a masterpiece. And masterpieces aren't a patchwork of different people from different centuries throwing stuff together. Committees rarely create masterpieces, and Genesis, it's a cohesive whole. It's got intricate beauty all throughout, and this communicates genius to me, and so I'm perfectly willing to say Moses was that genius. But let's ask the question of dating. When was the book written? This kind of depends on a couple of things, because again, there's no date affixed to the book. But the date for the Exodus extends backward. If you have a pretty solid date of Solomon's reign, if you go backward, then you're looking at 1400 to 1200 BC for the Exodus. Depends on how you interpret some dates and genealogies and how you look at the archaeological data as well. But I tend to favor that 1400 BC date. So the writing of Genesis occurs at some point there during the Exodus while Moses is in the wilderness with the people of Israel. Moses uses some sources. Not many, perhaps, but like in Genesis 5, it could be called the book of the generations of Adam. Well, is that a real book? Could be. Also, there's some evidence of editing after Moses' death throughout the Pentateuch, such as in Genesis 11:31, where it says, talking about Abraham and his family, they went forth from Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, that word Chaldeans comes from a later date than Moses. It refers to the people of Ur, ancient Sumer, Uruk, places like that. And then there's some place names in Genesis that are also using a later name, like in Genesis 14, verse 14, where Abram pursued those who had taken Lot as far as Dan. Now, Dan would have been named after the conquest, after Moses' death. These types of things are not damaging in the least to our doctrine of the inspiration and infallibility of Scripture, because we believe that any editing after Moses was also under God's sovereign plan and providence. And there's the story of Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy, so obviously Moses did not write that. To whom was Moses writing? What was their understanding of things in general? We, in the past 200 years or so, in the scientific age, have a tendency to interpret things according to what questions we want answered. So in the creation account or the flood account, Moses is writing to his people who have a totally different understanding of the cosmos than what we have. Now, that's not saying the Bible has truths that are not relevant for our age, or that the Bible is using fables or legends or myths, anything like that. It's just that the people have a different understanding and they have different needs than what we have. The eternal truths and doctrines are going to be the same. God doesn't change, and His Word is going to remain true. But this is a hermeneutical problem that we must resolve. What did the text mean when written? Before I blindly apply my own modern presuppositions to the text and subconsciously try to modernize it. What about the title, Genesis? Now, just like the author's name, there's no real title in the text for Genesis. The Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament from the 3rd century BC, they have a title, and that's where we get Genesis, and it means beginning or origin. The Hebrews had a tendency to use the first word in a book as the title, so there the first words in the beginning is the Hebrew name. So Genesis and in the beginning, that works. Let's talk about the structures in Genesis. When we're studying the Bible or a Bible book, we want to understand how that book is structured, what the plan of the author was. And with Genesis, there's actually several different ways we can find the structure. The first structure that we find is that there's two major portions. You've got primeval history, which is Genesis 1 through 11:26. And there you're talking about everything before Abram, before Abraham. You've got creation, you've got the Tower of Babel, the flood, things like that. From 11 verse 27 all the way to the end of chapter 50 is the patriarchal history. There you deal with Abraham and his family. But there's some who look at the Joseph narrative in the last several chapters of the book and say the Joseph narrative has some sufficiently different things about it that kind of breaks the pattern. And so instead of 2 major portions, you've got 3. You've got the primeval history, you've got the patriarchal history, and then you've got the Joseph stories. Well, there's another way of looking at the structure of Genesis, and this is using the phrase that was repeated all throughout Genesis. These are the generations of. This phrase occurs 10 times in Genesis, and so clearly for the author, this is some type of a logical arrangement or outline. These divisions, the use of this phrase, occur at chapter 2, verse 4, chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 9, chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 11, verse 10, and then again, chapter 11, verse 27, chapter 25, verse 12, and again, chapter 25, verse 19, chapter 36, verse 1, and then finally 37, verse 2. So this breaks the book down into 11 sections. Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 would be the introduction, and the rest of these are the generations of. Another structure that we find throughout Genesis is called a chiasmus, and this is a rhetorical device used by the Hebrews in their literature to elegantly make the point of a story, or even several points throughout a story. An example from the English language would be, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So there's wordplay there, there's repetition there. Genesis is full of chiasmus structures, and there are a wide variety of ways to demonstrate that. And we'll deal with that some as we look at the book. But one particular example, just to kind of illustrate it, would be in Genesis 3. There you've got the man and woman cover themselves in chapter 3, verses 7 through 8. And then in chapter 3, verse 21, the man and woman are covered by God. You've got God speaks to the man in verses 9 through 12, and then God speaks to the man again in 17 and 19. God speaks to the woman in verse 13. God speaks to the woman again in verse 16. God speaks to the serpent in verse 14, and then again in verse 15. So there's some parallelism going on there, and very highly structured, beautiful structure in chapter 3. What are the themes in Genesis? Genesis serves as the introduction to the Pentateuch, the introduction to the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole. So Genesis introduces us to God, to creation, man and woman, sex and marriage, temptations and sin, punishment and grace, the chosen people, the patriarchs, and then all of this points us to Jesus in the New Testament. So Genesis is like the overture of Scripture. Earlier, when I summarized the message of the whole Bible on the last video, that summary can also be seen in Genesis. You've got creation, the fall, resolution, climax, and closing. The resolution and climax is prefigured in Abraham offering Isaac, but a substitute is provided by God. The closing or consummation is shown in the dying words of Joseph, chapter 50, verse 25. So Genesis prefigures the rest of Scripture. I'm going to read just a little bit from the Baker Illustrated Bible Handbook to show you how Genesis relates to the rest of the Bible. This is taken from pages 30 and 31 of this book here, the Baker Illustrated Bible Handbook. And what we've got, this will be comparing some passages from Genesis with that similar passage in Revelation. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. In Revelation 21:6, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. God creates the first heaven and earth, eventually cursed by sin, chapter 1, verse 1. And then in Revelation 21:1, God creates a new heaven and earth, where sin is nowhere to be found. Chapter 1, verse 2, water symbolizes unordered chaos. Chapter 21 of Revelation, there is no longer any sea. Chapter 1 of Genesis, God creates light and separates it from the darkness. In Revelation 21 and 22, there's no more night or natural light because God himself is the source of light. In Genesis 1, God gives humans dominion over the earth. In Revelation 20 and 22, God's people will reign with him forever. In Genesis 1:27 to 28, you have the marriage of Adam and Eve. In Revelation 19 and 21, the marriage of the last Adam and his bride, the church. In chapter 3 of Genesis, you see Satan introduced sin into the world. And in Revelation 19 and 20, Satan and sin are judged. Genesis 3, you've got the serpent deceiving humanity. In Revelations 20, the ancient serpent is bound to keep him from deceiving the nations. And this goes on. I mean, there's over a full page of comparisons between Genesis and Revelation. And so that's just a short introduction to how Genesis is picked up in the New Testament and used. Favorite Bible stories in Genesis. What are your favorite Bible stories in Genesis? Well, I'm going to say that I've got a couple. I really like the story of Abraham chasing down the raiders who kidnapped his nephew Lot and pillaged Sodom, because here in Genesis 14, what you've got is, let me find the verse here I'm looking for. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. I love that story from Genesis because it shows Abraham, who was loved of God, had 318 trained men in his household who could conduct a nighttime raid on an enemy and rescue all the people they were after. So that's just one of my favorite stories. There's tons of others in the book of Genesis. I have preached through Genesis twice in my life, and it was a pleasure. And Genesis is probably my favorite book in the Old Testament. Well, that's all the time we've got for this edition of Stab the Dragon, and we'll try again next time. God bless.